I'm Mark Henick. This is So-Called Normal. Hey folks, welcome to So-Called Normal. Today on the show we have my friend Steph Guthrie. Steph and I met each other through TEDx Toronto way back in 2013. I believe she went on stage right before me or right after, something like that. Anyway, we through the TEDx Toronto setup, I didn't fully appreciate when I was selected to do my own, and Steph experienced this with me, how intensive the process was for months of writing the talks, of revising the talks, of getting coaching, of going to voice coaching and stage presence stuff and rehearsals and all this. So it was definitely one of the more nerve-wracking experiences of my speaking career, especially early on in the formal stage. But I shared that with Steph and so many great others. We had Mark Bowden on the show a couple of weeks ago, and it was the same for him. He was a colleague of mine that I met through TEDx Toronto. So one of the things that I noticed, though, when I first met Steph through that, was how routinely she gets targeted by online trolling and harassment. So we get into that in this episode. That was part of what her TEDx talk was about. This idea that you shouldn't feed the trolls. They should leave them alone. And she challenges that directly because Steph is a badass. She's a filmmaker, a film programmer, an educational consultant. She worked on the feature documentary A Better Man. Which has been covered by The New Yorker and BuzzFeed, and it's won a bunch of awards, so go check that out. She's a co-founder of Drunk Feminist Films. I haven't been to one, but I would love to go to one if I'd be welcome to do that, because Steph is just such a powerful advocate for feminism, and we really get into that. We get into her own story, and we get into the intersection between feminism, between the men's rights activist movement and all that stuff, and mental health and how it impacts her. So I think you'll really enjoy the show. I had a lot of fun talking to her. I think this is an important conversation that we have. So please let me know afterward via social media and otherwise. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts and let me know via social media what you think. I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this one. So that said, here's my conversation with Steph Guthrie on So-Called Normal. So I loved your TEDx talk. I thought it was wonderful.
Thank you.
Can you tell me a little bit more about the talk,
Sure.
but also what brought you to that point, what that process was like?
Right. So, the previous year, so in 2012, I had confronted a man who made a video game that was essentially inviting the user to punch in the face a feminist who they didn't like. And it was a specific woman. I just don't want to name her because, she's had enough to deal with.
Sure,
but
sure.
yeah, so the guy who had made the video game, he published it on with a username that was his own name. And I was a heavy user of Twitter, so I was curious if he had a Twitter account. And I looked him up and he did. So I tweeted at him, I tagged him in a tweet to notify those who followed me that this was the man who had made the feminist face punch game. And it became a thing. I don't know. It got, I encouraged people to retweet. And so it kind of blew up. And then, of course, there was like a backlash from, misogynists who supported this guy. And so that, I think, was I was invited to do a talk because of that experience. And my talk focused on basically, the talk was called "The Problem with Don't Feed the Trolls." And "Don't Feed the Trolls" is an expression that basically means if you think someone's a troll, don't engage with them because it's only going to encourage them. And troll in this context is often used just like as another way of saying like a bigot, If someone's saying something misogynist or racist or transphobic, like don't engage with them and, you're only going to encourage them. And I really disagreed with that philosophy. And so my talk was about how it's only through actually like engaging these viewpoints that we're going to bring about change. I mean, that was 5 years ago, and I still agree with like some of the basic tenets of that talk, but obviously, you know, our views change as we move forward in life.
I was going to ask you that, yeah.
Yeah, well, and I think one of the things that has changed for me, I don't think that I don't think as much as I did in 2013 that it's super useful to engage total strangers on the internet. I do think that we need to engage when people who are part of our communities and people who are our friends or our colleagues or our family members or acquaintances say bigoted things or do bigoted things. But when it's a stranger, I guess where I've come around to through much experience is realizing that strangers are not likely to listen to you, and you're actually a lot of the time just going to like reinforce their mentality that like they're a martyr to their cause.
By
you know,
making them dig into the issue.
Exactly.
I've read that about anti-vaxxers as well. People who really are very vocal that vaccines cause autism and all kinds of things that have been disproven by the science. But there was a really interesting article that I read that said that fighting with them didn't actually change their opinion. Actually, it made them embed their opinion further because they felt, like you're saying, that they had to defend it, that they doubled down.
Yeah, no, you got to protect the castle. Like, I think people really tend to dig their heels in when they're challenged, and I think especially I think it's different when the challenge is coming from someone you know and someone you have some level of relationship with, some level of mutual respect, and you know, someone you like. I think you're a lot more likely to entertain their viewpoint, you know, because you have some common ground. Well,
and when you did that talk, it was also, I think, it was before, at least in a popular sense, Cambridge Analytica, Russian trolls, bots.
It was a different time.
It was a different time. It was a simpler 2013. It was a simpler time.
Yes.
But, you know, now it's a profession. It's a whole movement, this idea, that trolling, in a way that it was only really nascent, I think, at the time then.
Yeah, well, and there's certainly lots of spaces for them to organize and to find validation for their viewpoints online, right? And so that makes those communities grow and makes the viewpoints themselves become more extreme over time because those spaces where they can organize allow those communities to kind of continuously grow and foment, right?
I often remark, but especially lately, and it seems to be getting more common, in U.S. politics in particular, but as U.S. politics always do, are bleeding over into Canada, how people can just invent their own reality, especially political leaders and other leaders in public discourse, and others just believe it, despite the fact that there's overwhelming evidence to the contrary, you know, and just recently this has been coming out. So, you know, that seems to be based on this idea that we start with belief first, and just because we believe it, it's true, rather than starting with truth first and then coming around to the belief in that truth. And that's kind of what you're saying, I think, in some ways, that people believe that everything they believe is true, despite the fact that it may not be. Nobody
likes to be criticized, and I think when our beliefs are challenged, it feels like a critique, right?
Well, it's part of our identity,
sure.
It seems. So it seems like somebody's attacking our identity.
Yeah.
It's from the outside, it seems like a core part of your identity, and correct me if this is wrong, is feminism. It seems like you're one of your main bags, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. What does that mean to you? What does feminism mean?
Wow, what a big question. I guess, I mean, really, it just means that I think that people of all genders should be treated with equal degrees of respect and should experience equal outcomes. Yeah, and I don't think it's just about gender either. And that's something also that, you know, just over time, I've learned a lot through the conversations that I've had. And 5 years ago, I think my feminism wasn't as aware of the challenges that other marginalized groups experience, and over time I'm still learning. We're all always learning, but I would say certainly at this point, my feminism is integrated into like a broader vision of social justice for everybody, people of all races, people of all gender identities, ability, disability.
You mentioned the men's rights folks earlier. where does that broadening feminism, are they still as frustrating for you and in some cases almost traumatic for many people as they once were? You know, this whole not all men thing, or men too, or whatever the hell.
Oh
it
yeah,
is that they say.
no, I think they're just as, I think they're more vicious now, and I think that the links between men's rights and in particular white supremacy have really become clearer in the last few years, you know, and people are really talking about that now, right? Like about how a lot of these mass shooters who are like anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, anti-Muslim, anti-Semite, they often also have a history of like domestic violence against a girlfriend or a partner, right? So there's been some investigations into the ways that these online extremist communities use young men's sexual frustration as a way to kind of indoctrinate them into even more extreme, like white supremacist views and like incel views, quote unquote.
Yeah, we saw that certainly with the Toronto van attack and a number of other attacks recently, it seems.
Yeah. And I mean, I mostly stay out of that stuff now because I'm not, I still use social media, but it's very like, it's pretty much just private and focused on people I actually know in real life now. Like I don't use Twitter anymore. And that was sort of the main vector through which people like that would access me.
Sure. And we chatted a bit about this offline already, that you, it seems to me, more than most other people, becomes a target for these people. You say things that a middle-aged white male could say, and nobody would even notice. But for some reason, when you say it, or even more broadly, not just to make it personal, but when a feminist says it, a prominent feminist such as yourself, they become a target in the most vicious ways, I think, that I've ever seen. Why? What's happening? How have you dealt with that?
I mean, I think that a lot of it is just that they, a young woman, you know, speaking in a very like forthright and like authoritative way on this kind of issue is just really out of sync with how they think women should be, right?
Docile.
Whereas if a middle-aged, you know, white man articulates it, it's like very much in line with how they think a middle-aged white man should behave. So it's not as, it doesn't like shock their belief system in the same way, you know? And how do I deal with it? I don't know. God, I like make sarcastic jokes about them to my friends. Like I don't know. I mean, it's really honestly, a lot of how I've dealt with certainly the attacks that I've experienced has been through sardonic humor. But interestingly, I've really pulled back from that since my trial, my criminal harassment trial.
Can you talk just a little bit about what that was?
Totally. So basically, I was a complainant in a criminal harassment trial where the communication in question took place on Twitter. And it was a precedent-setting case, and it was relatively early in this whole, I don't know, the culture wars thing that people, you know, it was before Gamergate, but like kind of just before Gamergate. And so it was a bit of like a harbinger for, because the person who was the defendant to the case was, you know, espousing viewpoints that were sort of men's rightsy, and I was a feminist. It became this real kind of early flashpoint in that whole evolving mess. You know, Christy Blatchford from the National Post was one of the only journalists who, she might have even been the only journalist who was consistently covering it. Like a journalist from a different outlet would come in for like one day at court, but Christy was the one who was coming in and writing about it regularly. And she, you know, I mean, anyone who's read her work has a sense of what her views on things like feminism and men's rights are. She's very anti-feminist and very pro-men. And she wrote a piece around the time of closing arguments that was, it seemed like SEO, like targeted to inflame the men's rights community. I think the headline was something like harassment trial could have grave implications for freedom of speech, right? And that was like it continues to be a huge, you know, talking point for those circles. And that piece ended up blowing up internationally. So, you know, Alex Jones and InfoWars wrote about it.
Really?
Breitbart, Milo Yiannopoulos did like a Twitter chat about my case with Lauren Southern from The Rebel, who started to come out and cover the case as well. And yeah, and so at that point, my Twitter account became a bit of an unlivable situation, right? Like there was no publication ban in the case. So my identity was known and was mentioned in all the coverage. And some of the coverage, some of the journalists who came out to cover it actually tagged me in their tweets from the courtroom. Thank you, guy from the Toronto Star, Liam Devlin Casey, for tagging me in your tweets. Anyway, sorry. I'm just like, obviously, have a lot of anger still in me about how journalists treated the situation. So, and in fact, in a way, that was, the way that the media treated me, and certainly the way that the defense attorney treated me was, I would say, much more traumatic, with much more long-term impact than my interactions with the defendant ever were, right? So the reason that I brought up sardonic humor and how that has kind of changed for me. So I used to be, and I still have a pretty like sarcastic sense of humor. I don't know, that's just sort of how I am. But during the trial, the defense attorney would question me about sarcastic jokes that I had made on Twitter or on Instagram. And he would interpret just the most like over the top meaning for it. So I think I kind of got to a point where I was like, you know what? Every little thing that I say is going to get picked apart and it's going to be interpreted in the worst possible light. So I'm just going to start saying exactly what I mean and being extremely earnest and never providing any ambiguity that can be used against me. I've become very like, well, it's starting to loosen up for me a bit now, but for a few years I was so careful about anything that I said.
Because of not wanting to be dragged through the coals again like that?
Exactly. Yeah. Even though I wasn't technically on trial anymore, that stuff just really gets embedded in your psyche. When you are being questioned about every little thing that you've ever tweeted, you start to kind of send all your thoughts to like a committee in your brain before you put them out publicly. It's like you have an internal like PR advisor who's like, all right, hold on, Lev, let's put this through the ringer. What are all the different ways that someone could interpret this? And let's make sure that there's no, question or, yeah, it's very exhausting. It was very exhausting. And I'm only now kind of starting to pull myself out of that and be a bit freer.
I hope that nobody ever puts my tweets on trial.
Me too. Me too. But your tweets are great. If anyone ever puts your tweets on trial, I'll be first in line to
I believe that I tweeted about Ryan Reynolds' butt not too long ago.
I support that.
What kind of impact do you think that other young women feminists or not even women, certainly young men or anybody speaking out about these kinds of issues, what kind of impact do you think that would have had on them watching your trial? Well,
that was something that worried me intensely at the time and still does, I think, I certainly think that anyone who was watching my trial and who's had someone, persistently engaging with them online in ways that they're not comfortable with, I think anyone who's experiencing that and who saw what happened to me would be very unlikely to think that the court system would be a place where they could find justice for that, right? I mean, I was so fortunate in many ways, right? Because, the cops listened to me when I went in to make a report and they arrested the guy and the Crown decided to press charges. There are a lot of people who might have been in my position who would never have even gotten that far, because they're Black or they're trans or they're a sex worker or whatever it might be. They either wouldn't feel comfortable going to the police or they wouldn't be taken seriously if they did. I'm kind of like the ideal victim in that sense, right? Because I'm white, I'm middle class, I have, a graduate education. I'm very well versed in like how to navigate a system like the court system, like I'm better equipped to do that than a lot of people. So it was a huge nightmare for me. And I think anyone watching it who doesn't have the privileges that I have would just be like, wow, well, if that's what happened to her, you know.
And you said that it was a precedent-setting case. So what precedent do you think it set?
I mean, I'm not a lawyer, so I wouldn't, I guess I should, when I say precedent setting, I guess I just mean there hadn't been a case like that before.
Sure, but I mean, online bullying and harassment is very, very much in the media ever since, well, even before Amanda Todd died by suicide. This is something that people talk a lot about. So it sounds like that your experience was pretty traumatic and that it was discouraging, would discourage others to ask for help. Yeah,
for sure. Well, I know that, so the judge in my case, he found that I was harassed, but that it did not reach a criminal threshold. And the reason for that is that for it to reach a criminal threshold, the complainant has to fear for their safety, and the wording of the law is that they need to have a reasonable fear for their safety. So you can imagine the difference between how I might interpret a reasonable fear and how like an older white male judge who's like never used Twitter might interpret what is a reasonable fear. And I know that the defense attorney, the like press conference or whatever that he did after the case, he made a lot of comments, and this was consistent, throughout the case. He made a lot of comments like this, but basically, and Christy Blatchford picked it up and used it in every one of her columns. But basically, the argument was he never explicitly threatened you, and he never said anything sexual to you. Although he did offer me rides to like Northern Ontario to go away with him for a weekend and like weird stuff like that, But because there was never anything overtly sexual and because there was never anything overtly threatening, this was just the drum that the defense attorney banged over and over. And he made a comment after the verdict was rendered, and of course the guy was acquitted, where he basically said that now people don't need to worry that they're going to be charged with harassment if they haven't threatened or sexually harassed somebody. And I don't know that that is actually the legal precedent that was set, but the fact that he like made those comments and that they were covered in the media, like that's a huge chill factor for anyone who's reading it, right?
Yeah.
So
another high-profile case that, as far as I know, didn't involve you in any way was Jian Ghomeshi and his female lawyer, Mark Henick, I believe is pronounced.
Yeah.
That seemed like a challenging dynamic for many people in the social justice world and the feminism movement to have such a prominent, successful woman defending a man who was alleged or did do such awful things to people. What are your thoughts on that, if any?
Well, I guess I think patriarchy is not men. Patriarchy is a set of ideas, right? And women can be agents of patriarchy as well as men. Women are maybe, because we experience the violence of patriarchy more acutely, we're maybe less likely to be agents of the patriarchy than men. But I think I know plenty of women who who have done maybe not comparable things like defend a very high-profile man accused of sexual assault, but certainly she's not unique, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
No, I mean, that's I think part of the assault on feminism from the outside, but I don't know if this is true within your world, but it's certainly true within the mental health space where I do a lot of my work, and there's certainly lots of intersectionality there as well, all kinds, but do you think that everybody working either professionally or actively, I think everybody's a feminist in some way, but people who are actually very active in this space, as you are, is everybody helpful? Is it great that everybody is speaking up in some way? Or are there people that sometimes you say, I get where you're coming from, but maybe that's not so helpful?
Oh, for sure. Well, I don't agree, with every feminist under the sun, and I think
but there's and again, to relate it back to the mental health space, there's a very strong argument for the case that at least they're saying something, at least they're speaking up, at least they're active in the conversation.
Sure, I think it's better. That's better than not, because I think through dialogue is how we that's how we grow. That's how our values become more refined and more aligned. And I think, I have definitely, especially in my early Twitter days, would sometimes tweet incredibly like self-righteous and like pretty blunt, opinions about things. And I was fortunate that there were other people in my online universe who engaged with those kinds of tweets and who helped me understand what was missing from my viewpoint, or like I remember one time I tweeted, I forget what the impetus was, but it was about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I tweeted something like, and this was when Stephen Harper was still in power. I think it was right after he had said that the missing and murdered Indigenous women inquiry issue was not on his radar. And I was angry about that, as lots of people were. And I was tweeting, like, this group wants an inquiry and that group wants an inquiry, and literally everyone wants an inquiry except Stephen Harper. And I actually had like a couple of, feminists, some Indigenous and some not, who were like, actually, not everyone does. And there are like some Indigenous women and organizers who think that we already have all the answers that an inquiry would deliver through previous inquiries, through academic research, through yada, yada, yada. And an inquiry is just a way to like direct more resources to like hemming and hawing about the problem rather than solving it, right? Which is a totally valid viewpoint that I hadn't considered, and that I was excluding by saying literally everyone wants an inquiry, and I'm a settler. Like, what the heck do I know about any of this, right? So anyway, I do think that it's good for people to like speak up and learn from the people who they have dialogue with. But I definitely, sometimes the things that people say, it's like, I don't think it's going to be necessarily helpful in like resolving the issues that we're all tackling or trying to tackle. But I also think that sometimes people's goals when they're expressing themselves aren't always to like help or to resolve the situation. Sometimes, especially people who are like personally impacted by whatever the issue is that's under discussion, people who are marginalized in that way have like a lot of pain and anger. You heard me making some angry comments earlier, right? Like sometimes you're just venting your frustration. And that can be helpful too in a way, right? Like it's maybe not helpful to others, but it can be helpful to you.
Right.
So, yeah.
There's kind of, people ask me, especially young people a lot, how to get involved in mental health advocacy and raising awareness and things like that. And one of the first things, and they never like it, but one of the first things that I often recommend is to really focus in on yourself. That you can't, while yes, it's good to recover out loud, to share your experience, to be open about it. There's an old saying in psychotherapy that you have to know why you're sharing. Are you sharing for you, or are you sharing for everybody else? And if you're sharing for you, then, maybe you need to do some more inner work.
Yeah. I think that's good advice, like to focus on yourself and get really clear on how you feel about this issue, how it impacts you, what your social location is in relation to the issue. Yeah. And I can definitely relate to some of those young people, right? Like who want to get involved with advocacy. Like I was super excited to get involved with advocacy, and, I have always had a lot of strong opinions, if you can believe it.
Really?
Yeah. And, I think one of the things that I've realized in the last couple of years is that I think, and this is so basic now that I like saying it in hindsight, I feel silly that I didn't realize this before. But I think a lot of the reason that I gravitated toward, feminist advocacy was because of my own pain that I've experienced. I had an abusive boyfriend. I experienced, some dynamics of abuse in my childhood home. And I was raped. This was all, not even in relation to like the criminal harassment trial that I went through. But, and I think that I wanted to like speak out about these issues as a way of trying to like, I'm a real workaholic. And I think my way of like dealing with pain at that time was like, well, I want to solve this situation. and I'm like not in touch with my abusive ex anymore, and I'm certainly not in touch with the guy who raped me and like whatever. So it's like I can't resolve them and what they did to me, but I can try and resolve the issues that led to them treating me the way that they did. And I think that I felt like advocacy and trying to push for systemic solutions to these problems was like a way of healing my own pain. But I was not really conscious of that, sure. Right? And so it wasn't healing for me at all. All I was doing was like deferring my pain, right. Basically,
projecting
right?
it out onto the world.
Yeah. And, you know, it's, and that was even to some extent the case with A Better Man, which is a wonderful film that I had the absolute privilege and honor of working on.
Can you tell me more about that too?
Sure. So it's a documentary that follows conversations between the director, Atiya Khan, and the man who abused her when they were in a relationship together about 25 years ago. And it's obviously a very heavy film, but an incredibly powerful one. It's their story. It's not meant as like a prescription for how these situations should or shouldn't be dealt with. But in their very particular case, the man who abused Atiya is beginning to take some steps toward trying to take responsibility for what he did to her. And in doing so, you know, Atiya being able to kind of witness that, it's been a rather healing experience for her, right? So, and my role with the film was mostly creating the educational materials around it to get people talking about it. So I created a bunch of different discussion kits, including one specifically for like groups of men to watch the film and discuss it together. We also created like a high school learning kit to go with the film with the Ontario Secondary School Teachers Federation. And then I also co-directed an interactive companion to the piece that interviews 6 different men who've used violence against a partner. Well, honestly, working on that interactive piece was like a huge emotional journey for me because what I heard in these interviews was these men describing the thing, you know, we posed questions to them that we had crowdsourced from women who've experienced violence. If you could ask the person who hurt you anything and know that you would get an honest answer, what would you ask them? So we posed those questions to these guys. And what I heard in these guys describing what they had done to their partners and former partners, I heard these guys quite often describing things that had been done to me, but that I had always been blamed for by the person who was doing them. I heard these guys describing those very same actions as abuse. Right. And even though it wasn't hearing the person who had done those things to me saying what I did to you was abuse, it was so validating to hear somebody acknowledge, you know, that getting very close to someone's face and screaming at them is abuse and punching a wall is abuse. And so anyway, I think that I gravitated toward working on this film also because I agree, and I agree with Atiya that if we want to end violence against women, we have to engage with the people who are using violence. We can't just of course we need to protect women and protect people who've experienced violence, but that is not a preventative approach. That's a reactive approach, and it's necessary, but we also need to focus on prevention. And yes, part of prevention is educating young people about healthy relationships, but part of it is also engaging with people who are using violence and helping to teach them how not to do that and how to take responsibility for it. So I think this was just, I say this not at all as a disparagement of the project or my choice to work on it, but I think that my choice to work on it was rooted in my desire to heal my own pain, but again, by distracting myself from it and focusing on the larger issue. And within the last 6 months, I had a conversation with my therapist, because I was considering starting another creative project that was also focused on men who've used violence and taking responsibility. And I was really excited about it. It was a virtual reality idea, and I still think it's a great idea, and I might do it someday, or someone else might do it before I get to it. But I ended up deciding with my therapist, I think I might be done focusing on these guys for a while. I think it might be time to just focus on us And at first I thought I meant us as in survivors in general. Mm-hmm. But I realized after that I meant me, the various versions of me who've experienced these things, right? Yeah. So I think I've turned inward certainly in the last year. And
you don't obviously have to answer this if it's too close, but does the man who raped you, if it was a man, know that he raped you?
Yeah. I actually had a really powerful experience actually relating to that guy. So it was a man. He had white dreads, which really added insult to injury. Sorry, I do have to make sardonic jokes sometimes about the horrible things that have happened to me.
Fine.
What do you do?
Yeah, you do whatever you have to do.
You do whatever you have to do. So, this was a situation where I was like blackout drunk at a bar and like couldn't hold myself up. I was falling. I had fallen multiple times that night. And my friends like took their eyes off me for literally like when I spoke with my friend the next day, he was like, I felt like I turned my back for 2 seconds and he had swept you out the door. Put me into a car. He was sober. He drove us back to my apartment. And I think he did think that the sex was consensual because we have really fucked up ideas of consent in our culture. And so I woke up the next morning and I rolled over and I was like, who is this guy? What are you doing? Like, what just happened? And he didn't use a condom and he gave me a curable sexually transmitted infection. So a few weeks later, I was at the same bar where he had found me. Ottawa has like a couple of bars that people like me want to go to. So I ran into him at that bar. It was really like I was there with a couple of friends who knew what had happened to me. And one of them was in the army and one of his army buddies was there. And his army buddy comes over and is chatting with us. And then his buddy is like, hey, I've got this friend I want you to meet. And who should turn around but my rapist?
Oh, wow.
And I completely froze. And I don't really remember the conversation for a couple seconds. And then I turned to my friend and I was like, that's the guy who raped me. And my rapist is standing there with his hand out to like shake my friend's hand. And my friend, like, I felt him just like stiffen completely. And he's like, I can't shake that fucking guy's hand. And then the guy is just standing there.
Did he recognize you?
Who's to say? But he's looking at me with this look in his face of like, who, me? I could never do I don't understand why this guy's upset with me. And just that look of like, who, me? Rage just like exploded out of my body. And I shoved him up against a garage door that was nearby. And I was just like, is it okay for me to swear on this podcast?
Yeah, go for it.
Well, I was like, I shoved him up against the garage door and I was like saying the word fuck a lot. Like, you fucking raped me, you fucking asshole. You gave me fucking chlamydia. And like, and shoving him up against this garage door. And some people will say that it's not appropriate for me to use violence. But this was not the kind of violence that's going to like cause any kind of harm to somebody. And I'm sorry, but what he did to me was violence. And I really felt my rage like rippling through my limbs as I shoved him up against the garage door, which sounds like a weird thing to say, but it really felt like I was taking that energy that he had literally put inside my body that I didn't ask for. And I was saying, this isn't mine. You have to take it now. You take it now. And there was a reciprocity to that like that was the one. I don't feel that I have suffered long-term trauma from that experience. And I firmly believe that it was because I had that opportunity to confront him. Every other person who's done me harm, I never got anything like that. And I don't think that it was the I don't think that it was the violent nature of my body touching his. I think it was simply like the physical nature of it. It was the transference of energy that was so healing. And my friends stood up for me too, right? And that was huge. Your friends don't always stand up for you, unfortunately. I was very lucky.
Through your work on the film and through this experience, for sure, you know, you hear a lot now, especially with so many prominent men and celebrities in the Me Too movement. But now some of the men are starting to come back. Louis C.K. and Kevin Spacey and a number of others. The immediate justified reaction, I think, is, well, you can't just go away for a couple of months or a year and then come back and everybody will forgive you.
Yeah.
So through what you've learned through your own personal experiences and through the film, what do people, men or women or whoever else, who have used violence or who have abused others, what should they do in order to make that right?
Well, I think it's actually kind of a callback to what you said earlier about, like, instead of focusing on being an advocate and making public statements, you need to really focus on yourself for a while. And not just on yourself. Actually, you could probably stand to focus a bit less on yourself and more on the people who you hurt. And, you know, it's not going to be possible for many of these people to engage directly with the people that they hurt. Those people may not want contact with them, but they need to try and think about what it must be like to be this person and to think, like, to really grapple with, like, what you did and
not just a form apology written by your publicist.
No, exactly. And this is the problem, is that, you know, our understanding of this issue is now so firmly built on how celebrities have responded to this issue. And of course, they're responding in a very PR-driven way. And I mean, the reality, unfortunately, is that even when people on a smaller scale do these kinds of things, that is often, you know, especially with social media, you see lots of like non-apology Facebook posts where people are like, I've heard some rumors that I have engaged in conduct that people feel is not, you know, just this really like weasel words, you know, and I've seen a lot of that. And I've informally mediated some situations involving that kind of thing. And the problem is that most of the time, and this is sad to say, but most of the time these guys are really just focused on rehabilitating their reputations.
Because they're terrified
they don't
own it?
Yeah. No, they're terrified that people are going to think of them as a guy who does these things. They're not, and they may have some shame about what they did, but it is so often just overshadowed by this like grip of fear about the world thinking that they're a rapist and or a, you know, whatever. And, you know, I really think that they could direct a lot more of that energy to like thinking about how all of this has impacted and is impacting the person who they hurt rather than how it's impacting them. Sure.
And often, I mean, from the mental health angle, it's kind of cliche, but it's hurt people who hurt people. Very often men have been abused or traumatized themselves, especially as young kids.
This is especially the case for domestic abuse, right? Yeah. Like, I mean, the majority of people who witness or you know, who have violence in their childhood home don't go on to use violence. But the vast majority of people who use violence in adulthood did either experience or witness violence in their childhood home, for sure.
And then especially men being as in the masculine culture that they're raised in, not being able to actually talk about that or open up about it, or maybe they don't even remember it, but it's obviously influenced them.
Yeah, totally. I think people internalize those things in ways that are designed when they're children to like protect themselves from it, you know, and sometimes that means walling it off completely, especially if you're a guy who like, if you ever express any emotion that isn't anger or joy, you're like, you know, a pussy or whatever. Yeah.
I love this idea in dialectical behavior therapy of acceptance and change, that you can accept something. That doesn't mean you condone it. It doesn't mean you approve of it or anything like that. You just accept that it is what it is. You did this, or this happened to you, or whatever it is. It just is what it is. And then only from there can you change.
Yeah.
And that if you're running from what actually happened or what you did or what you believe or whatever, you'll never change.
No, it's totally true. Yeah, I think, you know, that kind of reminds me of right kind of in the immediate aftermath of the verdict in my trial, another woman who had been a very high profile, like much more so than me, victim of like online misogynist mobs, she reached out to me, and I was talking about how I keep like waiting for the moment when my life is going to go back to normal. And she was just like, you know, things got a lot easier for me when I accepted that what has happened is a part of my life now.
Yeah, it's the new normal.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean that it's going to be like that forever,
right.
But the fact of the matter is that this happened and that this is going to like transform you in some way. Of course, it's like a monumental life experience. It's going to impact you. And rather than trying to get back to the way that things were, you know, it's better to like integrate this reality into, you know, your narrative of your life.
Sure, yeah. Use it, do something with it. You know, make something good with it.
Yeah, that's what I'm working on.
It sounds like that's what you've been working on all your life.
Yeah, yeah.
Which is incredible because you've had such an influence on the world and on peers. And, you know, what would you say now to, we talked a little bit about this, so young women who are just starting to come in and wanting to do what you do, what would you tell them?
Oh, you know, I guess I would just encourage them to not feel like they have to be strong and tough all the time and not feel like they have to constantly be putting themselves out there. You know, one of the things that I have found really challenging about especially like the current state of the conversation around how feminists should deal with this climate of, you know, escalating extreme misogyny and particularly online. A lot of the discourse, including from like, and primarily from feminists, is like, oh, well, we can't back down and we have to just keep speaking. And, you know, like I've heard people throw around an Audre Lorde quote that is often being thrown around in a very decontextualized way, that your silence will not protect you. And this is used as a kind of motivation to like, well, you know, you've got to just keep at it and keep speaking up. And I have to say that pisses me off. Like, I'm sorry, but speaking up can be very dangerous. I think there's a lot of pressure on young feminists and activists of all stripes to not let the bastards get you down, quote unquote. I think you're just running from reality if you insist on, like, sometimes they are going to get you down. Yeah, sometimes the bastards get you down. And
well, resilience isn't about staying up all the time.
That's it. You have to give yourself space to, you know, I mean, I'm like, right now I'm working on a script for a horror film that's actually about it's about my trial. It's about my rape. It's about my abusive ex. It's about all of that, and it kind of rolls it into one story. That has been the result of over the last year, I've done a ton of personal writing, and I haven't been sharing it for the most part. I've shared excerpts here and there. I've shared some excerpts on, you know, Instagram or what have you. But that writing has mostly been for me, and it's been a space for me to like connect the dots between my different experiences. And in fact, I've found connections between some of these experiences that I was not even aware of prior to beginning the writing process. Like, for example, during my trial, the whole situation with the face punch video game guy got brought up in the trial, even though he was not the defendant. But you know, I don't even know if he actually had tried to kill himself or if it was just hypothetical. But there was this like, well, if he had tried to kill himself, if he had killed himself, how would you have felt? Because, you know, the implication being that it would have been my fault if he had killed himself. And like, guess what? My abusive ex-boyfriend, one of his biggest tactics was to threaten self-harm or threaten to kill himself and say that it was my fault. It was because of my behavior, right? So I had not connected those dots. But through this personal writing that was very much for me and not focused on sharing with the world, but just focused on like, what has happened to me and how has it impacted me, and fuck everyone else for a little while. You know, I don't think I would have gotten to this horror script if I hadn't like spent this time really focusing inward. So I don't think we always have to speak up, or maybe sometimes speaking up is something that we just do to ourselves, with ourselves.
Well, I'm so glad that you're still speaking up on Facebook, at least, even if not on Twitter, because I've learned more from you, I think, over the past 5 years, and have been inspired so many times and challenged so many times in a good way, I think.
Thank you.
That I'm really grateful. I feel really privileged to know you.
That's so kind of you, Mark, and I feel the same. I really value your voice and the work that you're doing, and it's very unique, and I think you're impacting quite a lot of people, so thank you.
Thank you. All right, that's it. That's Steph Guthrie. What a powerful person, and especially to be able to open up in her own vulnerability about the stuff that she's been through, the legal battles, the film, all of her activities in the feminist realm. I think her work is so incredibly important, and I'm really interested to hear your feedback on that. So share the episode share the show on social media. Tag me. I'm at Mark Henick, at MarkHenick on Twitter, on Facebook, on Instagram and LinkedIn and YouTube and everywhere else you could. I'm not hard to find. You can go find me. Steph Guthrie is also a public speaker, so I think she's still with the National Speakers Bureau, but you can Google her and check that out. Go to her website, stephguthrie.com, and read more about her. My website is markhenick.com, markhenick.com. You can go over there, markhenick.com/so-called-normal, read more about the show. I told you at the top, but I'm going to tell you again, subscribe. Go over to Apple Podcasts and subscribe to the show. Leave us a rating, but we're also available on Google Podcast, on Spotify, Stitcher, Libsyn, Castbox, wherever else you get your podcasts. So we'll come to you however you need. So check us out. If you want to try out some free psychotherapy, a free trial of online, safe, effective psychotherapy with credentialed, trained individuals, counselors, psychotherapists, go to betterhelp.com/Mark, M-A-R-K. Enter the promo code Mark, again, M-A-R-K, not M-A-R-C, M-A-R-K, and you can get that free trial of a couple weeks of free online psychotherapy. So go check that out. Hope you enjoyed the show. Share it with your friends. I'm Mark Henick, and this has been So-Called Normal.